Good afternoon. Ooh, very loud. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back. Thank you all for joining the session looking at a new era for labour migration. Welcome back. It's great to see so many people in the room. It shows that the topic of the session is relevant and pertinent. This session today is considering whether or not we are entering a new era for labour migration. I think by now there has been a thread through the course of the VMC that demonstrates that demographic realities in Europe are strongly encouraging, forcing governments to review the way that they manage labour migration, how they design their international partnerships, and also how they attract global talent, because the EU is very often behind in terms of the race for international talent. At least we have the perception that we are behind the United States, behind Canada, and behind others. And that's not only for these very high-skilled talents, but also for some of the key shortages, the shortage sectors that EU member states are facing. In this panel, we will have a diverse group of government, international, and private sector representatives who will share their insights with us. In ICMPD, I think that we do have a strong feeling that there is some sort of a balance shift in how EU member states are talking about labour mobility, skills mobility, talent, very often avoiding the term migration, trying to separate and remove some of the more toxic dimensions to the migration discourse that is often taking place in the EU. Vice President Skinas set the context very well for us by talking about there is a need to open the door. There's a need to give legal pathways. There is a need to give labour pathways in order to have a balanced migration relationship with partner countries. And then in the future of work, I think Janina set the stage in a very powerful way for us. 30 million global vacancies, 2 million in Germany, 400,000 in the Netherlands was mentioned in the panel just before this one. And the clear message is that companies need policymakers to facilitate. We're in good hands with the panel that is here with us today. We have Joe Antoons, who is managing partner of Fragomen, a global immigration services firm. Alexander Wilhelm, Director for International Relations from the Federal Employment Agency in Germany. Patrick Philipp, Director Certification and Standards from the International Road Transport Union. And Hendrik Bourgeois, Vice President, Government Affairs Europe from Intel, an ICT technology multinational. So we are in very good hands. I am Jennifer Tangney. I am the Senior Program Manager for the Migration Partnership Facility. I think you've heard the word partnership a lot today, and it's going to continue as a thread throughout the VMC. The Migration Partnership Facility, or the MPF, is funded by DG Home, the European Commission, and since 2016 has been working on facilitating and funding cooperation and partnership between EU member states and priority countries in a whole range of areas, from borders and security to asylum, reintegration. At the moment, I think we're the most famous, if I say famous, in our little sector for the labour and skills mobility pilot projects and schemes that we are supporting. So until now, 16 projects have been funded and are either closing, where we've learned some lessons, are in implementation, and many more in design. These schemes and projects develop blueprints and provide litmus tests to demonstrate how labour and skills migration can take place when you invest in the ecosystem and the institutional relationships that you need. But instead of really telling you a lot about these projects and the different dimensions that they all include, it's my pleasure now to share a very short video from one of the MPF grantees to give you a flavour of how, one, small EU member state is rising to the challenge and thinking outside of the box. So it's my pleasure to introduce the digital explorers.
Small states don't have to think small, just small organizations don't have to. So we decided to take the challenge and try solving some European riddles.
In the last few years, Lithuania has worked hard to position itself as a European tech hub. But the results are being impacted by a severe problem affecting Europe, which is also harming the Baltic country.
People prefer to go to the US, Canada, or New Zealand, or Australia than to come to the EU.
It's in this context where Digital Explorers was born, a talent attraction and development program tailor-made for ICT companies. Created initially as a solution for the Lithuanian market, but with the potential of being replicated in the rest of the continent.
Talent doesn't come into the conversation when you talk about Nigeria. It's a huge opportunity there.
Despite some not too optimistic opinions about the potential effectiveness of the program, the team managed to row against all odds. And the results? 13 Lithuanian companies and 30 Nigerian ICT specialists have joined Digital Explorers. After the program, 18 Nigerians prolonged their contract in Lithuania, while the rest continue their careers in Nigeria, making it a win-win for both countries.
So just a little taster. I think Janina mentioned that the scale of these projects is very small, but I'm pleased to say they can grow. And the new phase of Digital Explorers 2, now includes Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, and is targeting Nigeria, Kenya, and Armenia, with 150 participants being targeted. So it's still a modest start, but it's showing that there can be lessons learned and institutional structures developed. But now I'm very pleased to hand over the discussion to our panel. And I turn to you first, Joe, if that's okay. Considering the discussions and the information we've heard today about the future of work and evolving the landscape, it's evident, or maybe it should be evident, that we are on the brink of a new era for labour migration. How do you see the current situation?
Well, maybe we have been discussing at length the labor shortages. You discussed, how do we make all those initiatives successful? I mean, one of the basics of all this is having proper immigration channels. And we all know, in most of the European member states, and we hope even more with the implementation of the new EU Blue Card scheme, that we have immigration pathways, effective immigration pathways for highly qualified people. I think that's a fact. Although we see, and we heard this morning, that even there in some countries, like in the Nordics, there are even initiatives in Belgium to make it even more strict to be eligible for an EU Blue Card scheme, for example, by increasing salary thresholds. But that said, apart from those immigration channels for highly qualified, we see, unfortunately, although there is some liberalization for immigration pathway for skilled or essential workers, that this is not across the board. And I think we will talk about the new pact or the new bill in Germany to attract skilled workers. We see initiatives in Italy to open spot for quota for essential workers. But we see, unfortunately, even in those sectors where there is a clear need, like the IT sector, like the healthcare sector, that not necessarily we can bring, even if we skill up people, that we can bring them in if they do not have the necessarily degrees, or they do not have, or do not meet the immigration salary thresholds. And and we are now, it needs, what was said as well this morning, it needs to happen now. it's there, it needs to happen now. But on the other hand, we see as well that we are now in some European jurisdictions, you have elections upcoming, so we fear also a little bit that the now might still be postponed a little bit, that we can break the trends right now. Now, apart from having immigration channels, another point that I want to raise, it's about how do we retain the talent or make sure that we can take maximum advantage of the talent or the skills that are available in a certain European jurisdiction. Give you one example, okay, we as a business, the business welcomed very much the implementation of the researchers and student directive that created the job seeker permit for foreign students that completed their studies in a European member state to stay there, to look for a job, start a business. That's, for example, a very good example where a lot of companies take advantage of. But now, for example, we have companies coming to us and say, hey, these Ukrainian nationals that can work under the temporary protection status, can we hire them? Can we keep them in the long run? Unfortunately, that's not the case in a lot of member states. You can't change in status, in country, your status. You can't go to a migrant status and have a long-term perspective in that country. One thing that I also would like to highlight is the initiatives that are taking place with Talent Beyond Boundaries and others to, I would say, make sure that skill shortages could potentially be addressed by displaced talent pathways. You see, for example, in the UK that they have created complementary pathways for displaced talent. We see that conversations are ongoing in Ireland, and we see some successful, I would say, outcome in certain sectors like the healthcare sector. Another point that I want to raise was said as well this morning. It's about hybrid work and remote working. I mean, while we're looking at immigration channels to attract talent, we also need to make sure that what is essential or critical to attract talent that is equally available in the immigration schemes. When we talk about remote working, hybrid, working arrangements, we see that in a lot of member states, a lot of countries, that is not explicitly, set out in law what needs to happen. We see additional complexities by notifying authorities like in Ireland to enable the authorities to do effective inspections at home addresses. On the other hand, and this is something that I also would like to highlight, when you look at the business and you develop HR policies, for remote working, you always need to make a distinction between your locals, EU nationals, and your foreign nationals. For example, a lot of companies say we enable, our individuals to work, when they are on holidays in Italy, to take 1 additional week, 2 additional weeks to work from there. I mean, if you are a non-EU national, it's not obvious that you can work, from another European country without securing a work authorization. We know that some countries have developed digital nomad schemes, but they're not available in all jurisdictions. They're nice, I would say, visa alternative, but they're certainly not the golden boy, that can resolve the remote working requirements. We see, apart from immigration, if you work in another country, what happens to your social security scheme? Europe has come across with a new framework agreement, but here again, it's quite difficult for employers to navigate all this and ensure compliance. And the last point that I want to raise is about digitization. We see across the board there is development in digitization, online filings in more and more European member states, for example. But while we all welcome from a business perspective this development, we see that this doesn't necessarily impact the overall lead times to obtain work authorizations. I mean, if you look at it, you know, and I'm talking from a Belgian perspective, it takes more than 6 months to have someone work ready on the ground. It was discussed earlier today, how can you attract talent? Are you asking those people to wait for 6 months in their home country till they finally get the work authorization? Can we arrange them to work in their home country while we are waiting for the work authorization? These are all business concerns that we need to address in immigration policies to make sure that we can fill, you know, those labor shortages.
Thank you very much. So clearly, the legal context is sometimes not fit for purpose, but even when it's there, it's not giving the efficiency that's needed. Alexander, if I can turn to you, please. The Federal Employment Agency is actively now looking to recruit internationally to meet your labour market needs. And you have adapted how you're working in order to meet this objective. Maybe you could please tell us about the changes that you have brought in.
Maybe let me start with explaining a bit and very briefly why actually designing skilled labor migration towards Germany matters to us as the Public Employment Service. Because what I realized, often people ask me, you have an international apartment, isn't it your job to bring domestic job seekers into employment? And I said, yes, this is still our main job, but what do you do when there is an increasing demand for skilled workers, but less and less supply? And this is what we have seen in Germany for many years already, that we do have a high demand, especially for skilled and what is often called semi-skilled workers, although we don't do this distinction in Germany that much. And then it is a logical consequence that we had to reconsider also our business practices. And this is why, and this is something I also wanted to add, I mean, the shortages we see in Germany is despite all our activities to increase actually the labor market participation of domestic job seekers, to increase the integration of refugees and the high number of refugees that we have in Germany into the labor market. And also, we are very thankful for the EU intra-mobility that we still receive in Germany. We still have the fortune to receive EU workers coming to Germany. But of course, we see that we're all sitting in the same boat as EU countries, and we can see we all face the same demographic change. And with this change, and Germany is one of the countries that will most severely be affected by the demographic development, that we need to look outwards. And this is what we did as the BA already 10 years ago. We started 10 years ago with our first pilot projects with the recruitment of nurses in this case in non-EU countries, together with our distinguished GIZ colleagues that are here as well, with the Triple Win program that some of you might know. And but thanks to the success that we generated, but also thanks to the massive increase in demand for skilled workers in Germany, already the previous German government has launched a new Immigration Act in 2020 that made it easier to come to Germany when you're looking for a job, especially for skilled workers. But we could see that this, even through Corona, and especially right after the recovery, the economic recovery after Corona, that this was not enough. And this is why the government has decided to launch even a new and more progressive Immigration Act and major reforms in summer this year. Most of the elements will come into force by the beginning of next year, some of the elements a bit later. And against this background, we had decided as the German Public Employment Service that we also have to align our policies and our strategies to make it possible also for us with limited resources to give a bigger and brighter and greater contribution to and to increase the numbers towards Germany. And what did we do? We reconsidered our strategy that is basically now based on 3 pillars. We have one pillar that what we call the gatekeeper function. because this is probably something, I don't know about all the other public employment services, but from the ones I know, it is a rather unique function that we have as the German PES, that we are part of the visa process. So from the majority of the people that are taking up employment in Germany and coming as labor market migrants, they need a work permit, and we carry out the labor market admission procedure as the public employment service as part of the visa process. And while doing so, we are checking and guaranteeing that we can offer fair working conditions to migrant workers that are comparable to what we have to the people that already live and work in Germany, with comparable qualifications in comparable positions in the regions. This is important, it's a regional approach. What we also do, and this is something where we see for us the biggest leverage effect actually, or the potential leverage effect, is that we want to improve our provider function, this is how we call it, and this basically means that we want to improve our multilingual digital offers for informing individual job seekers and supporting companies also that want to recruit abroad in this process. So what do I need to know about the procedures for living and working in Germany? How does it work? How do I find a job? And we do already have like kind of an international job platform that we are part of as the Federal Employment Agency on the German portal makeitingermany.com, so where you can also, the companies can already publish the job vacancies for international job seekers, and also international job seekers can also register their profiles. And this is something that where we see we have still lots of limitations in this. This is something that we definitely want to improve a lot, and where we see, as I said, the biggest leverage effect. But, and this is the third pillar, of course, what we have been doing within the last few years, especially within the last 5 years, and that we build up something that we want to increase also, and that we call the trailblazer function. We have established bilateral partnerships, we have concluded agreements with other public entities, mainly public employment services, but sometimes it's also overseas workers agencies in most of the Asian countries, for example in India or in the Philippines and in Indonesia. And with these partners we want to also boost our pilot projects and actually widen them, because at the moment we have a clear focus, of course, on the recruitment of healthcare workers, but we have started also recruitment successfully in the electrical sector, for example, IT professions, and also in certain handicraft professions. So, and this is definitely something that we want to extend in the future. But as mentioned, from our point of view, probably, although we want to accelerate, of course, these projects and programs, they will probably always have a limited scope, because we do have high expectations on employers also participating in these programs, because we feel obliged as a public entity to the international standards of fair recruitment, and that basically means, as most of you know, there is the employer pays principle. So, and this does include also the preparation process. And I was wondering this morning in one of the panels, someone said, how can we abolish the recruitment costs for international recruitment? And I said, I just thought by myself, we shouldn't, because for every skilled person you recruit abroad, someone has done an investment already. And it's nothing but fair also for a company to invest in someone that he or she is recruiting abroad. And so there needs to be some certain investment, and it is probably also a wrong signal from my point of view to give the impression that international recruitment is something, or an international worker is something you will get for free. So definitely, of course, the costs are too high. This is what we know, and this is often too high because of the red tape and the bureaucracy that we have in the process, and this is something we can work on. But I think it's important always to point out that there will be recruitment costs for international recruitment.
Great, thank you very much. I think we have several follow-up questions for you shortly. Patrick, if I turn to you now, please. I'm looking at some statistics here because I think they stuck with me when we had our preparation chat. The global shortage of professional commercial drivers for truck, bus, coach, and taxis is accelerating. And I have a statistic here, which I think you're actually even going to already correct and disimprove. But 11% of driver positions were unfulfilled in 2022, with 1/3 of drivers retiring within the next 3 years. Unfilled driver positions could more than double by 2026. So for those of us that like our online shopping, we may have to start to consider alternative options unless we find some solutions. In July this year, together with the International Transport Workers Federation, you launched a 3-point plan. It would be very interesting to hear about the key challenges you identified and the measures that you recommend in the context of labour migration policies, particularly focusing on the recruitment and market entry for commercial drivers.
Thank you. Thank you first for bringing RIU to that event. So we represent the commercial road transport globally, and we are certainly very paying a lot of attention to what would be the workforce of tomorrow. Without commercial road transport, goods are not being delivered. There are disruptions in the supply chain. And it's actually not only the industry that is suffering, it's the society and the economies as a whole. We all have in mind some distortion in the supply chain when you have empty shelves in the supermarkets. That happened not that long time ago in the UK during the COVID period. No supply in the hospital. And the reality that is today is that kids are no more delivered to the school by public transport. And that's happening in Belgium. Because they don't have enough drivers, so they cut the concessions. It's as simple as that. So we're taking that seriously. Today we have 2.6 million shortage in commercial driver. And we are looking to have about more than 6 million shortage by 2028, because the pyramid age in our industry is not positive. We have a big problem is to attract new entrants, and we'll touch on the root cause of that issue as well. And the gender balance is not very positive as well. So what we're looking at is certainly to be able to offer job perspective in our industry and career prospects. The reality is that we have an industry that can offer employment opportunities, but it's true that so far there is a mismatch between the demand for drivers and the availability of potential qualified drivers to be able to fulfill these positions. There's certainly a geographic mismatch that we can certainly look at and then possibly find solution in order to mitigate that problem. It's not a short-sighted solution, certainly, but we are working on it for some time, and that's what we can start to look into. Exactly what was happening in May, we have had our global resolution on legal migration, which was very important, being recognition by the industry as a whole that there are opportunities in order to get legal migration as a solution to also fill part of the missing position in the driving seat. That's a consensus that has been reached. It necessitated time as well, because certainly the political will and the political support on legal migration is one of the challenges. I think it has been tabled earlier today, but it's a reality that we are witnessing as well. Another area that we are looking at is certainly to bring in young entrants. It's a technical barrier that we have mostly. The reality is that the access to profession in the EU to commercial driving is somewhere, depending on the country, between 18 and 23, and generally currently more towards the higher ends. which obviously, when you think about you kids being at school today, if they exit school and you say, oh, well, I'll be interested to become a commercial driver because there is a part of adventure in it. Well, yeah, maybe, but consider it in 5 years again. That's a no-go. Obviously, they all engage in another career, and we are generally not getting them back when they have reached the age to join the profession. We're also working on women. Traditionally, commercial road transport was not an industry where we had a big representation of women. It is changing as well, gradually, steadily, particularly when we speak about mobility, so passenger transport. Here we have a higher rate of women, and we see more and more with good results. But also, interestingly, in freight transport. There are companies that have made tremendous effort with good results in order to have a much bigger gender balance and reaching even majority in some cases. There's still exceptions, but they're good examples that we can get inspired in. Now, one of the realities is that we just don't need drivers. We need qualified drivers. The reality that today you need to ensure safety and professional excellence when you're operating a commercial vehicle. Generally, people are obviously aware on their own safety. And it's the same that when you board a plane, you just want to think that, well, I want to make sure that the captain that is sitting in front of the plane is someone that is well qualified, to say the least. Well, actually, in commercial road transport and specifically in mobility, the reality is the same as well. You want to be safe during your journey. You want to make sure that you won't be involved in an accident with possible dramatic consequences. But we've been working on that for years now, and obviously we are uplifting the standard, we are harmonizing the level playing field in order to make sure that, well, the qualification of commercial driver improves year after year and matches the requirement of the industry, but also the requirement that technology is driving. Because the vehicles that are operated today on the public infrastructure, they're also embarked with technology that we need to master. So we need to establish that level playing field. We need to build up the competencies. We work a lot about skills profiling. That's something that we do on our side, RIU, in order to have comprehensive skills profiles so that we can really benchmark, but we can measure to make sure that when we have someone that is in front of us, not only we can say, oh yeah, he's been somewhere qualified or he has a driver card, he's really going through a thorough process where we can ensure that he can demonstrate knowledge and professional competencies.
Thank you so much. And now, last but certainly not least, Hendrik, I turn to you. I mean, as an employer, with a particular context, maybe looking at the EU, what is the primary challenge that you face in attracting the right talent or the right labor? And what strategies are you doing or putting in place to address these?
Thank you very much. Thank you for the question. I'm delighted to be here. I'm delighted to be here because I work for Intel. Intel is a manufacturer of semiconductors, microchips. And so I have to answer your question, I have to take a step back and give you a little bit of a context before I give you a direct answer to the question. We make microchips, semiconductors, which are key components to virtually any technology product that is being sold today, whether it's a smartphone, a PC, medical devices, energy products, cars, automobiles, very important key components to technology that is sold and manufactured today in the European Union and the rest of the world. And unfortunately, it's an industry that is subject to very fragile supply chains, where particularly for leading edge technology, the more modern technology, there's a dominance of supply in Southeast Asia, which makes that the European industry and the industry in the United States is very vulnerable to supply chain interruptions. It's something we've seen in the COVID situation where we saw shortages of automobiles in Europe because there was shortages of supply. And so what governments have been doing in Europe and in the United States is to promote investments in manufacturing of semiconductor technology. Manufacturing. This is very expensive. And the reason why I'm explaining to this is that my contribution to this debate is not only the fact that migration policy, labor mobility is not only important, but it is becoming critical and existential to private investment, to foreign direct investment, but it can be based also in a broader macroeconomic and even geopolitical context. So what the United States and the European Union have been doing to attract these investments is they've been providing incentives, subsidies to companies like Intel to make these investments. And we're talking about billions, tens of billions of euros or dollars. And so that's what Intel has been doing. We're investing in Germany. We're building a very large semiconductor fabrication site for semiconductors. We're expanding our facilities in Ireland. We're going to build a site in Poland. And all of this to try to not only, because we see the market growing as a private investor, and so we build for the future, but also because we are being supported by governments in Europe, by the European Union, by the US administration, who are adopting legislation, the EU Chips Act, the US Chips Act, to encourage us to make those investments. Well, all of this becomes without any importance if we don't find the skills and the talents to operate the factories that we're going to build for the future. And that's the very simple message. And so that's why it is of extreme importance to get migration policy right and to develop more flexible, more modern approaches to labor mobility, specifically in the European Union. And I loved what Alexander was saying about the changes that they were making in Germany. I think these are very good examples of what needs to happen. But what we're doing, to answer your question now, and I'm sorry it took some time to give a broader context, but what we're doing is we're trying to deal with the hurdles on a day-to-day basis that are created by work permits, by visa requirements, in the various phases of where we're working with talents to attract talents. And it starts, as you probably know, it starts in the local embassy or the local consulate, where a candidate needs to apply and needs to provide a lot of documents, not copies but originals that need to be apostilled or legalized or notarized. That takes a long time. Then the next step, it goes to the office that like for instance what Alexander does. There needs to be an assessment of whether the job for which the candidate is applying cannot be filled with a domestic candidate. And then last but not least, which is very often disregarded, I think, is the local registration requirements, which is, which you have to go to the police, you have to go to the social security, you have to go to the town hall, and where unfortunately the resources are such that the whole experience that candidates have to go through is not very welcoming. It's not an experience that is candidate-centric, I would say. And so, the challenge really is, number one, you said we see more digitization. Maybe that's the case. I don't see enough digitization. I see still a lot of applications that are handwritten, sometimes requiring it needs to be in blue ink or not in black ink, stuff that is of the 20th century, really, or the 19th century. And then secondly, I think there's also a question of speed, and that is related really to the fact that public authorities are not allocating sufficiently scarce public resources to deal with the processing of those applications. And that's why you're in situations like in Belgium where you have to wait 6 months. And this is something that needs to be addressed. I think it needs a cultural change, mentality change, because Europe is deindustrializing. It's not about only demographics that are changing. I think it's also Europe is at the risk of being at the receiving end of globalization. And it's not going to be sufficient for governments to say, okay, we're going to spend some money to encourage a company to create a factory. There needs to be an ecosystem. And critical in that ecosystem approach is labor mobility and finding the right ways to attract the right talent in the sufficient amount of talent.
Great, thank you very much. We've heard today and throughout the course of the morning that there are many initiatives that are being discussed and prepared at the EU level. From the recast of the single permit, the long-term residence directive, to the talent partnerships with specific countries, and also this proposed EU talent pool. But given that most competence for migration resides with EU member states, I think it's also really important to consider how relevant these initiatives are to the end user, the employer, or the migrant. So, Jo, if I can come back to you again, I mean, in some ways, is the diversity and the complexity of EU member states' pathways, is it essentially an own goal? Because if you look at coming to Europe, you're not looking at a region, you're looking at many different individual pathways that are all complex, called different things very often, particularly for those at this lower than university type level. Is this something that you think the EU should be addressing to try and bring coherence, or do you think that this should be really left to the member states individually to have a member state Hunger Games and compete against each other?
So you said, I mean, when you look, businesses, they face a lot of complexity because of the variances between the national immigration rules. And it's not only for skilled workers, it's even for highly qualified workers. And what I say here is, despite the fact that we had an EU blue card, an EU single permit, that we have now the revised EU blue card directive, when you look at it, then you may ask yourself two questions. Do these initiatives really attract the talent to Europe? Do we now see that Europe can compete with Australia, New Zealand, the US with this EU blue card or the single permit? That's the first question. Second question is, do we see that those initiatives really create that coherence? Do we see that the member states' immigration schemes are to some extent harmonized? Well, I hope that the revised EU blue card scheme might attract more talent than it has done before. Whether there is more coherence between the national immigration scheme, I can only say when I look at the new EU blue card directive, it has not been implemented in all of the European countries, but you see, first of all, a lot of may clauses. So there is a lot of discretion for member states to decide which direction to go. Secondly, member states can keep their parallel national schemes for highly skilled workers. So in the end, there is not a European scheme that will replace the patchwork of the national schemes. I must say, luckily, because if you would have a European scheme that replaces the national schemes, instead of creating additional channels for attracting highly skilled, you would have more, you would have reduced channels, because the European scheme would be probably the most conservative scheme of all the schemes that exist. So in that sense, I can only say those European initiatives probably do not, contribute to what we want to achieve. What Europe, in my opinion, and what I like in those initiatives is what they need to focus on, what is the real added value that Europe can bring. And that's what was said this morning as well. If we want to compete with other regions, We need to promote Europe, Europe as a brand. A highly skilled talent, they do not come to Germany or to Poland or to the Netherlands. They want to have access to the European region as a whole. So in that sense, what I really like about those European initiatives, that they create enhanced European rights. Okay, when you, for example, are a highly skilled worker and you work and live in one European jurisdiction and you relocate to another European jurisdiction, that the periods of residence in the different European jurisdictions contribute towards permanent residency and give you in the longer term, to some extent, the same rights as EU citizens. Or that you, for example, when you have a European combined work and residence authorization in one member state, that to some extent, with that single permit, you can work as well in another European member state, doing some business activities or doing even further on the basis of the EU ICT scheme. Or that you have gone through the entire European EU blue card process in one European jurisdiction, and then you relocate to another European jurisdiction. Why should you prove again that you are highly qualified? Okay, that you simplify the process when you go to other European jurisdictions, and that you can have the speed on the ground in that set. So I think this is what Europe needs to focus on. And as I said before, if you are a foreign national having a work authorization in one European country, why wouldn't you be able to do remote working in another European country? You don't access that labor market. You don't, in the end, work for a company over there, but you just do your work remotely. And that way, we can at least create a little bit of more European, I would say, brand or European feelings for non-European countries. Now, again, I like the idea of the European talent pool. I think that is something that could work when when this platform is set up. But again, to my earlier point, that can only work when there are underlying immigration channels available in the member states. If they're not there, it's nice to have that matching system, but how would that people ever get on the ground? And to what was said earlier, if you do that entire exercise and in the end those people cannot obtain a work and residence authorization, I don't think that's a good message towards those candidates. And then I would like to close with one maybe provocative statement. Okay, we're talking about the complexity and the variances amongst the EU member states, and we see some countries that really restrict their policies because they want to have and remain, gain and remain into control of the migration flows into their jurisdiction. They have really long processing times. Now, companies, what they're looking for, what they come to us for is saying, can you help us? We need those people. They are asking us to map immigration systems around Europe so that they know where are we going to invest, okay? Or we see companies relocating their businesses because immigration channels are not available. They're not able to attract the talent. And what we see now as well, companies are require, more and more strategic workforce planning strategies for Europe. Okay, that they say, okay, we see European jurisdictions that have more flexible immigration systems. These are the jurisdictions where we can create a talent pool of non-EU nationals. We can have those people, they land on the ground in those European jurisdictions, and those jurisdictions serve as the gateway to deploy the talent in other European jurisdictions, based on the free movement of services, based on EU-wide permits. And what we see with all this is that restrictive policies create even, I would say, a undesirable counter effect of trying, to circumvent the hurdles that we see. And I don't think that is what we all would like to have. So in a nutshell, I think the European initiatives that we now see will not solve what you just said. But I'm here, the business is here at the table to start the conversations, both with the member states and the EU level, to make this happen.
Thank you. Alexander, over to you. I mean, do you see that the EU level enhances the national in the context of labour migration?
Well, I think there's probably very different point of views where whomever you might ask in the different institutions, in the different member states. And I was just starting to laugh because I was just thinking, oh, maybe George just ruined my positive story I wanted to start with. Because I noted for myself saying, that the EU Blue Card Directive actually in Germany, it was quite a success story. I mean, like between 2012 and 2022, we have issued almost 200,000 blue cards in Germany, but this covers more than 80% of all the blue cards issued in the EU market.
You don't have a parallel national scheme that is more favorable than your EU Blue Card scheme, so that's your immigration channel. But I'm happy for Germany, you know, and for the EU that it worked in one year.
Yeah. So, I mean, like coming from this, I actually wanted to say, of course, there are examples where you can see there can be really a value added by these kind of EU initiatives. But when we look at the legislative framework for labor migration towards Germany at the moment, and with the new changes coming into force by the beginning of next year, we already have a very liberal and progressive legal framework for skilled labor migration. So there's probably little impact and little room for improvements by EU initiatives. And of course, we also already have bilateral partnerships, we have experience with pilot projects, but nevertheless, I think that on the EU level, there are at least like 3 fields where you can see there could be a value added. First of all, these kind of initiatives, and this probably goes well with what you just said, these kind of EU initiatives also show to people outside the EU that we need skilled workers in the EU member states and that we are open to labor market migration as the European Union. So let's call it a kind of a marketing effect. And on the other hand, of course, the EU can also play a very important role in improving and initiating like mutual learning processes between the member states. So what are good practices? What are good procedures to deal with skilled labor migration? What are like maybe procedures that you could avoid? And also what you just mentioned, the effect of or the benefit for someone entering into one EU country that has maybe the possibility to be postponed to another EU country for a different position easily. I guess this can be a added value of these kind of EU initiatives. And also, last but not least, when we look at the more recent initiatives like the talent pool and the talent partnerships, the ideas that have been drawn so far, probably they can also generate or create some kind of a leverage effect if you link them smartly to the instruments that we already have in place, like the Euros portal, that we can make better also and can improve, and also link it and give room, following the principle of subsidiarity, to link these initiatives with existing partnerships and projects that are already in place. And I guess this is what I can say, that from our side, we highly appreciate, therefore, the participatory approach that the Commission has been taking on this. And probably, if we follow this way, there can be added value.
Great, thank you. Patrick, I mean, skills recognition and legal pathways for those in your sector coming from outside the EU area is a challenge. Is there an EU-level solution that you think could be brought into play?
Well, it is true that for us, we're an industry that is extremely fragmented, and I think that capacity of companies to be engaging in hiring abroad is really at the starting point. We witness some larger companies, and we'll come back to it, that have been looking into mostly on the eastern side now, or Far East even. We speak about the Stan country, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, etc., which is a reality as well. Not necessarily with a lot of success, because we're a bit in a gray zone. And it's not necessarily formalized, and we need to have more formalization in order to help to have more transparency, and at the EU level as well, because otherwise they will go through the EU member states where the entry barrier are the lowest. And that's what's happening today. We are witnessing that. It's a reality. And once they are in the European market, they will go to the other EU member states. So it is existing, actually, today. However, it's behind the curtain. Oh no, we don't want to see that. And that's what's really happening in our industry. Currently, there is about 10% of non-EU driver in Europe. And certainly, you will certainly think about, populations are like from Ukraine and other ex-CIS countries that are making certainly part of the workforce. So what do we need now? I think that there is definitely the opportunity to offer a career prospect in our industry, and hence, again, support the European economies. I mean, we are at the point where we are testing the resilience of our economies. If we are stopping the supply chain, if we are stopping mobility, the impact will be dramatic. So we need to support here. Companies on their side, they need to mobilize themselves as well. The private sector has its role to play. We've not always been exemplary. Again, we are in an environment where 80% are micro to small companies. And then we have about 15% of SMEs, and then a very small percentage of larger companies that are able and capable to have engagement to the level that we are discussing. But certainly, they need to offer prospect and decent work. That's absolutely essential. There is a need for political support, true political support, in order to facilitate, I think, what you mentioned so far and what has been discussed till today in the different exchanges has been clear that we need to have further support, political support, but administrative support. Make things clear so that we understand and we have visibility about the engagement model, because otherwise they will not come. And we are at that risk. Global driver shortages, it's global. It's not only in Europe. So they will go somewhere else. Canada is a good example. There's been a program between South Africa and Canada that has been working extremely well, as one example. And then technical, that's the third one. So first one is economical. Companies, they need to provide decent work. We need to have the support as well, political, and ultimately technical. We need to review the conditions, of entry to the profession, but there are other technical nightmares that we need to comply with, which are only non-physical barriers. They are administrative barriers. They can be addressed. There are good European instruments and UN instruments that they're looking at it, but we need to move faster. And with all of that, we'll certainly have the possibility to get the right people, offer career prospect, and continue to get our industry, but more importantly, our economies moving.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Hendrik, I turn back to you. You've already partly answered the question I was going to ask, which is how important is it for you in where you decide to place a business about the availability of skills? You mentioned subsidies, and of course, subsidies are nice. They're a good incentive, but if you've got no one to work in the plants, then it doesn't make much sense. I mean, as Intel and as a very large multinational, I mean, I assume you have a big machine for identifying and attracting talent. Would you see, from your perspective, a talent pool as something that would be useful or attractive?
Sure. So I'll try to not repeat what I said, but talent pool, absolutely, because one of the challenges, to be honest, that a company like Intel is facing in the semiconductor industry is that we want to raise the awareness that the industrial background of potential candidates can be very diverse and broad. You don't have to come from the semiconductor industry in order to find a job in the semiconductor industry. I mean, we're looking for candidates from the aviation sector, from the pharmaceutical industry, from the automotive industry, and then having such a platform that kind of, can be used as a mechanism to raise that awareness would be extremely important. But I just wanted to pick up on what was said before, and it's really interesting to see how a sector like the transportation sector is facing similar challenges in the semiconductor industry. I, for one, would certainly advocate for less fragmentation and differentiation amongst the EU member states, because I think it leads to arbitrage in investment decisions, and I think it has a tendency to weaken the competitiveness of the European Union vis-à-vis other countries in the world, right? And so if I want to attract investments in Europe, I think European solutions are to be promoted. So that's the first thing I wanted to say. And then the other thing is, one thing that is critical also in the semiconductor industry is with respect to the visa requirements. Typically, they're easier to obtain in function of the level of education or specific experience, right? So in university degrees, easier to obtain than non-university degrees. In our sector, we're looking for between 60 and 70% of the workers that we are going to require for a factory in Magdeburg and Saxony-Anhalt are manufacturing technicians. So not people with university degrees, and people who have university degrees usually are not interested in coming to work in a manufacturing plant, so there needs to be, I think, a more tailored approach that is responsive to market realities. And if we don't fix this, I think we're going to have continuing to solve this challenge that we're facing in Europe in lots of sectors, apparently, not only in the semiconductor.
Sure. And there's a whole ecosystem in terms of service industry, in terms of schooling, in terms of other social services that need to take place around you.
Precisely. And so, yes, we look at how much money public authorities are giving us to set up a factory. Yes, and it's around 30%. And a factory to make leading edge semiconductors can cost over 20 billions of euros. So these are very important amounts of money, and so it's very important not only to look at that aspect, but to ensure that you invest in a place where there is an existing ecosystem, or that has the capability of building an ecosystem, right? An ecosystem of suppliers, of relationship with educational organizations, with universities, and that is really what's driving ultimately the decision. But I think that there's historically a lack of focus, and people have generally overlooked the importance of attracting qualified talent. And I think if we don't adopt and change the existing policies, this is going to become an increasingly serious bottleneck and hurdle that will have to be addressed in one way or the other.
Thank you very much. So I think we've had some very interesting presentations, answers to questions, but maybe not answers to all the questions. So I see one hand immediately up, two hands. So I will ask you to come here, and then number two, this gentleman. Yeah. Please do introduce yourself and your institution when you're asking a question.
Thank you very
No,
much.
the microphone's not on.
I am testing again. Microphone is on. Wonderful. My name is Victoria Rietig. I lead the migration program at the German Council on Foreign Relations. We are a think tank in Berlin. Thank you so much. This has been an extremely interesting conversation. We've mostly talked about attracting workers. My question is about retaining workers. And here's the background of this. In Germany, we have more and more a narrative that we are terrible at attracting people for all the reasons we talked about. But then once we have them, they leave again after a few years. Not in the sense of a happy circular migration, but in the sense of they leave because they're frustrated with German work culture, or frustrated with the lack of availability of childcare, or they're frustrated with racism and discrimination, etc. So I would like to know from you, do you have any data that actually backs up how big that problem is? Because I hear about this very anecdotally, But I have yet to see actual data that tells me, is this 1% of people, 20%, 50%? I'd like to get a better sense of that. So that's question one, and I know it's uncouth to ask a second one, but I'm really interested in talent grabbing schemes. Some of you probably have followed the United States luring away 10,000 tech workers, Canada luring away 10,000 tech workers from the United States. So people already kind of curated into the United States, working in the Silicon Valley and in the tech sector there, and Canada opening up a neat channel for exactly 10,000 people as a pilot this year, and within a few hours those spaces were filled. So Canada very actively is grabbing the talent the US has been attracting. So coming back to our conversation about, are we in the same boat, as Mr. Wilhelm said, or are we actually all in boats rowing against each other? I'd like to know, do you have any specific examples of this happening in Europe already between member states where we're grabbing the talent off each other quite openly and publicly? Thank you.
Thank you. We take the next question here as well, please.
Thank you. David Kipp from the German Institute for International and Security Affairs. Great panel. Thank you so much so far. I'd like to understand a bit more what you think are the consequences of this relatively weak EU instruments in attracting talents, because the innovations come from member states, and so we see a growing competition in attracting talents, and of course that can reinforce economic disparities between member states as well. So I'd like to hear how, maybe beyond or below comprehensive reforms of EU migration acquis, what could be instruments in order to increase some of the EU instruments at hand? And maybe a second question, to be more concrete, to Intel and the exercise of setting up this plant in Magdeburg is really interesting, because maybe you can tell us a little bit more about the challenges there, because of course you need a whole migration infrastructure that is probably not existing, or at least not as much existing as you need it to be in terms of administrative structures and kitas and all the social infrastructure as well. Thank you.
Thank you. So I think we will try and get this round answered. There are also a couple of questions coming from our online participants. Thank you very much for that. Looking at talent retention and the departure rates, I don't know who on our panel would like to take that. Alexander, would you have some information on levels of attrition?
Yes, I do. I mean, I do not have data yet I can give you immediately, but I can mention that we actually are carrying out a study on this. And we already have some pre-results, which is more the qualitative aspect. So it's more asked people for the reasons why they're actually leaving the country and not staying, but there will be more data also, and so will be definitely something that we can share once it is all published.
Great, thank you. I mean, I think when it comes to talent grabbing, I don't have any specific information. I have to say, looking across EU member states, of course, there is competition and very often language issues. You know, someone is trained in a specific language that is invested in by a particular member state and then chooses to go to a different member state with the same language, then, you know, I can see that there are at times some challenges there, but intentional piracy, I haven't heard anything about that. I don't think that you would know either, Joe, anything that you are aware of?
No, but I would like to add something to the question regarding the competition between the member states, maybe, because I think it always sounds like there is something bad in competition, and in general, there's nothing bad about a certain competition also, because it can lead to innovation, it can lead to better conditions also for labor migrants and all this. So this is also something that we should focus on. But what it shouldn't do, what competition shouldn't do definitely, is to undermine international standards of fair migration.
Yeah.
So this is something that we should really have an eye on, and fair working conditions and all this, what it is related to. But apart from this, there is nothing, in the first place, there's nothing bad about a certain rate of competition also, and because it always gives innovation also in this sense.
Yeah, and I think there was a study of the OECD about talent attractiveness indicators, where indeed all the OECD countries have been compared with each other to what extent are they able, to attract highly qualified workers, entrepreneurs, and things like that. And you see migration policies play a part of it, an important part of it, but there is so much more, why an individual might choose country A compared to country B. So I think that's a really very interesting study as well. And you see as well as things evolve, that digitization, for example, has also been a very important aspect when it comes to competition and when it comes to choosing one country compared to another.
And maybe just to say that on the talent attraction side, there is also the EU Talent Booster Programme, which is looking at peripheral regions, looking at member states that maybe have less of a track record in talent attraction. And maybe just to plug a small initiative, ICMPD with Egmont Institute and EPC is looking at the moment at a range of issues linked to legal pathways and labour migration. And one of them is looking at talent attraction, at what are municipalities doing, what is the national level doing, and where are the added values at EU level. And there's an awful lot of creativity at the city level in terms of attracting talent. So watch this space. We will be reporting back. Hendrik, if I can come to you.
Yeah, thanks. I liked your questions about retention. I don't have data, and we're just going to start to build in Germany. We're going to start to build in Poland. We have been in Ireland since 1989, and our retention is good in Ireland. And I think it has to do with a wide variety of factors. I think language is very important. I think the ability to create a diverse and inclusive working environment. We have, I think, about 26 different nationalities working on our site, not only EU. And one contributing factor also, I think, about, and this is the paradox about the ability to retain talent, is facilitating rotations also. I mean, we have other sites in our group, and one thing that we really promote is we send our employees for training periods, for instance, for about 6 months a year to other sites outside of the EU sometimes, to share best practice, to obtain learnings, and to bring them back to the site of origin. And the ability of local authorities to have flexible approaches to these short-term assignment, both on the receiving end and departing end, I think is extremely important, I would say. And then if I can ask the question about Magdeburg, I think it's not only about, it's a good question, of course, and a very relevant question. I think it's a huge challenge. And we're only starting, we at Intel, we're only starting to scratch at the surface of this challenge, but it's not only, I think it's not even immigration infrastructure, it's infrastructure period, right? It's really about, is there an international school? Are there enough restaurants? Are there enough hotels? Are there enough, living spaces? Is there a good connection between Magdeburg and Saxony-Anhalt and Berlin, where the major international airport? That type of stuff, right? So, and this is where, I really like my job because, I work with, public authorities to make those realities happen and to change those dreams into realities. And working with local governments, with regional governments, co-investing, creating programs to make an environment that makes it attractive to come and work in Magdeburg. And this is a huge challenge, and it's daily work, and we're spending a lot of efforts and money in trying to make that happen.
Okay, question. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Sorry, I'm negotiating on answering questions from the chat. So I will take a question from the chat, and then we would have time for maybe one more question from the floor. We have a question from the chat that says, in most EU countries, the highest demand is in medium qualified vocational professions. These jobs are usually offered by SMEs in native language. How can this challenge be addressed? You mentioned Ireland made language a little bit easier, having English. Alexander, do you have an answer for how the challenge can be addressed?
I mean, especially in the case of SMEs, you can see that there is definitely a big need also for infrastructure, public infrastructure also, that supports companies in international recruitment. And language training in the country definitely is definitely something where you, at least in Germany, we do have offers. They are not as tailor-made as they should be, and they should be more tailor-made also for SMEs, especially for migrant workers. They can be made better, and of course the quantitative amount probably should be better also, but it is a public offer, and there is a public support for this, and this is definitely something that you need. And from our experience, we have projects that we carried out with SMEs as well. And sometimes I can say I was surprised that there are SMEs that are more willing to invest actually in international recruitment than big companies that are always thinking, oh no, I might attract someone else, I just need to give it some time. But the SMEs normally know after a while, no, they won't attract anyone because they have tried everything. And so they really, if they go the way of international recruitment, they know that they have to invest and they know they have to do something. And there are many SMEs offering a lot that bigger companies do not do. Like in integration support, helping with housing questions and all this, but nevertheless, of course, at a certain point, the mission of a company ends, and then there's also something as integration into the society. And this is something where we need infrastructure in all of the municipalities. This is not something that you can be solved on the federal level or on EU level, but this is something that needs to be addressed also on the local level. And we need good integration support structures on the local level, and this is true for the language training, but this is also true for support in housing, for the support in when we look at all the public authorities, for example. I mean, especially in rural regions, you will hardly find someone in a foreigner's office that actually speaks the native language of the people. Maybe you're lucky and have someone that speaks English, but probably not someone that speaks Georgian or that speaks whatever. So we do need an infrastructure for this, for supporting this, because the companies itself, as SMEs, they won't be able to solve all these problems. From the bigger companies, I guess we can expect a bit more. They can do a bit more. And what we also see as a good solution is if you create also like kind of communities of smaller companies, for example, by the support of associations, federations, chambers, that can play a role also to help smaller companies to bind these aspects together and make recruiting abroad easier.
Thank you. We could take one question, but whoever gets the microphone gets one question, and one only, and it needs to be short for a short answer, please.
Thank you so much. I'm Shabnam, the Assistant to the Commissioner for Human Rights of the Republic of Azerbaijan. We carry out quite a huge work for the protection and promotion of rights of people, of all categories of people, including migrants and also people with disabilities. And my question is that what kind of maybe programs or sub-programs do you realize to provide the work for migrants with special needs, for example, with disabilities, like visual impairment and something like that. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for the question. I think it comes back to what you were saying, Alexander, that it really is about the municipal level, about the local institutions and the accommodations that are provided to nationals of the country also being provided to those migrant workers. And this still comes back to ensuring that there is comparative decent work and respectful workplaces for migrants as well as nationals. Would that be a fair response? Okay, so we are going to have to wrap up. I think it's a session that could have continued for another while. Do we conclude that it's a new era for labour mobility? Show of hands in the room? Yes? You need to put your hands higher. Be convinced. Okay, we have an audience that's about 50-50, I would say, maybe 40-60. I think it's clear that we need this new era. The needs are great. We need to break down the silos. The ministries of the interior, the employers, those in charge of skills recognition and validation. We need more integration of all of these different systems so that the matching of skills isn't a futile exercise, but is one that gives rise to a pathway and to a job. We look forward to the new package on maximising talent that the European Commission will launch in mid-November. I think we should watch this space and see what the negotiations and the compromises have brought to that package. And I will never lose one last opportunity to plug, but the Labour Mobility Practitioners Network, which is the kind of forum with these types of discussions, is funded through the Migration Partnership Facility. ICMPD is the secretariat. If you're interested, please do register to join. And we have an in-person event in Brussels in November. So please do check it out if these kind of discussions about operational solutions are of interest to you. I take the opportunity to thank the panelists very much. We really appreciate your time and your engagement, and also to thank you as the audience for your engagement too. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.